to, after thinking about and thinking deeply about what the situation is and what the perspectives and experiences and priorities and so forth are of young people during and after wars, we're now looking at the policy dimensions of these challenges, which are, as we know, formidable. Before we start, I'm going to do a brief introduction of this very distinguished panel, and then we'll begin. So I'm going to start with Ian right here, the Sector Manager of the Fragile States, Conflict and Social Development at the World Bank. He previously was a Sector Manager of the Post-Conflict and Social Development Unit in the Africa region, and was manager of the Conflict Prevention and Reconstruction Unit at the bank as well. Ian is an economist, which, when getting to know Ian, is rather surprising because he doesn't speak like an economist, as you'll see. A lapsed economist who's worked in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and he has a number of publications: Natural Resources and Violent Conflict, Options and Actions, Gender, Conflict and Development, and something that I was able to contribute in, as well as Gary, the other half of Gender, Men's Issues in Development. Mark Hannafin is in the Office of the Administrator, the Executive Secretariat at USAID. In his current work, he oversees all special assistants and serves the administrator. Prior to moving to the USAID front office, he served for 5 years as a deputy director and senior conflict advisor in the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation in USAID. During his tenure there, he led the task team in planning for the Sudan referendum, which must have been pretty interesting, pretty exciting. Mark is an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Relations at GW and teaches a course there on conflict and programming and analysis. He holds a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School, where Diane and I have both taught many students at Tufts University. Nicole Golden is a colleague of Mark's at USAID. She's a senior advisor in the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. In her current post, Nicole manages internal policy and strategy creation, as well as critical White House interagency development policy initiatives regarding youth. She joined USAID in September 2009 from the State Department, where she was an advisor to the Undersecretary for Democracy and Global Affairs, leading strategic and policy planning and global youth matters, she was in that position, brand new in that position, I think, when I first met you. She obtained her PhD in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Kate Almquist is an adjunct faculty senior fellow with this African Center for Strategic Studies. Previously, she held a variety of posts at USAID, including Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Africa, Sudan Mission Director, Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Africa, and Senior Policy Advisor to the Administrator. Kate holds a Master of Arts degree in International Studies with concentrations in African Studies and Conflict Management from SAIS at Johns Hopkins. And last and certainly not least is Lakshita Saji-Prelis, Children and Youth Program Director at Search for Common Ground. He has extensive experience working with youth movements, and youth-focused organizations in conflict and transitional settings. And get this is quite a range: Los Angeles, Northern Uganda, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Republic of Georgia, and Abkhazia.
You need to read the whole thing.
Not yet. Saji holds a master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution from the School of International Service at American University. So, as you can see, we have a truly distinguished panel, and we're going to start off with Ian for his comments. Please.
Thanks very much. First of all, when Mark invited me, I was hoping to be part of the first panel, because it's a lot easier to point to the problems than to give you suggestions on how to resolve them. So this is a really tough one, and I say this with tremendous modesty that at least I work in the World Bank, and we haven't come anywhere near close to figuring out how to address this problem. So with those words, since I don't do PowerPoints, let me just give you a little bit of a preview of what I will try to talk about. I'd like to start with a couple of words to set the context about jobs in Africa. I would like to tell you a little bit about how we are changing the way we see the problem. A couple of words on scaling up. And then I'll try to make 6 general points that I hope vaguely come close to being connected to policy implications. These are more sort of thoughts and questions rather than solutions, but I certainly hope that I can learn something both from the audience and from my fellow panelists. First of all, let me. We come at it as a development agency. We often start thinking about the problem of youth by thinking about jobs. Not all of the problems that we've been talking about really go away when you have a good job. Not all of them, but a vast majority of them disappear if people have jobs or prospects for good jobs. Our researchers did a little exercise a couple of years ago, and they said, okay, what would it take to reduce the unemployment rate in Africa by half? Whatever it is, I don't recall what it is. This is sub-Saharan Africa, over, say, 10 to 15 years. Their estimation is that it would have required 184 million jobs to be created. These are new jobs. And if you've heard throughout the day, that it doesn't even begin to scratch the problem, because most people work in the informal market, right? And so that's just a formal job. So just to set the context, that if you come at it from a jobs perspective, the challenge is absolutely daunting. The numbers, we need to keep reminding ourselves of what are we talking about. Why is it more difficult in Africa? For a very simple reason. Africa does not have a manufacturing base. And here I'm relying on my economic sort of background. Without manufacturing, it is very difficult to create lots of jobs. And if you take fragile states or post-conflict countries, it's even worse, because whatever chance they had of having manufacturing has been destroyed by the conflict. Okay, so in terms of formal employment, this is really, really, really tough. We're also, as development economists or as development practitioners, we're very bad at knowing how to create jobs. And look at the discussion you have here in your own country, right? It's jobs, jobs, jobs. We really don't know how to create jobs, right? The only 2 things that we normally look at when we're thinking about jobs is economic growth and labor markets, right? That's what our economists tend to do. Now, growth, the problem in Africa is growth is not very labor intensive, right? So you're not going to create a lot of jobs, even if you're growing at 10% a year, okay? Second is labor markets in Africa don't matter that much. So the distortions that our economists find don't really matter, because it affects probably 5% of the labor market. The other 95% is not affected by whatever policies the government has or doesn't have, right? So when we look at it as jobs, we're just not going to get very far. The second point I wanted to make is the conference is about conflict, post-conflict societies. This discourse also has been the youth bulge. Is it a security threat? I mean, that's usually how these conversations start. We've moved a little bit away from that. If you look at Africa, there aren't many overt conflicts as there were in the 90s, right? So what we see is a series of countries that are fragile, where conflict may or may not be a factor, or there may be cycles of violence. It's not a linear, you're pre-conflict, you go into a conflict, and you do post-conflict, right? That doesn't happen in this world anymore. But what we do see is government states that are incredibly weak, very fragile. And so we're trying to sort of change the discourse and thinking about that fragility of the state. Some of us who are also coming at it from a social anthropological point of view, we've kind of tried to change the discourse and to force us to think about societal fragility and not just be state-centric. And we see very much this problem of youth exclusion as something contributing to societal fragility rather than a pure security threat. Societies that are not coherent will not succeed, no matter what the state, how capable the state are. And the state can't succeed without more coherent, inclusive societies. So it's a slightly different lens. We haven't quite figured out what the policy implications are, but if you change the perspective, sometimes that leads you in a different way in terms of finding solutions. The other point is, look, all of us development agencies, NGOs, we all have little programs that are trying to deal with these issues. I have one in Rwanda and South Sudan on Adolescent Girls Initiative, right? We all have little programs. The problem with these small pilot programs is that they often work. And they work, why? Because they tend to bypass the state. We donors pay a lot of attention to the program. It's a small program, it's very limited, manageable, and so we often find that we see very good results. They're very intensively supervised. Everybody pays a lot of attention. The challenge is not that. The challenge is how to scale it up. And once you try to scale it up, it gets really hard. The reason why it gets really hard is because you then have to work with the state. There's no way you can scale a national program that excludes the state. Once you have to work with the state, remember, fragile states, very weak institutions, very weak capacity, very weak human capital. And that's usually where these things break down. So when I listen to this type of talks or dialogues, or I read, everybody has programs that are cool, that are doing wonderful things. When I go back to my office, I say, how do I do this into a national one? Yeah? And how much is it going to cost me? And how do I work with the state? That's the challenge. Okay. So let me try to hit some of the policy sort of what do we do about kind of stuff. The first one is, I listened to some of the talks and I want to identify anybody, but if I were to list all of the priorities that I as a developer practitioner was told to focus on, I'm sorry, but it just won't happen. Think of a young economist working for USAID or the World Bank, going to talk to the finance minister and reading the set of priorities that I heard this morning. All the things you have to improve, all the things you have to do better. The minister's just going to throw up his hands, right? So it's not enough to say, to address youth, to address young women, we need to do 1, 2, 3, we need to strengthen this, we need to do a better job of this. That's the whole problem. It's catch-22. These things are not happening because you have a very weak state that is incapable of doing those things, right? So the priorities have to be very focused, and they have to be a couple of things that begin to make a difference. You can't go to a government and say there are 20 priorities, then they're not priorities, they're everything, okay? And don't forget that the government also has to worry about the non-youth part, where somebody else will come up with another list of 40 priorities, right? So you have to help these poor governments, even when they're trying to do things well. You have to help them and say, okay, let's narrow this down. Okay, this one would be cool to do, but you don't have the capacity, so let's be realistic. Don't try it, right? So narrow the priorities. Focus which are the ones that matter, and as a couple of the speakers says, context, context, context. Why does it matter in Uganda? Why does it matter in Sudan? The second, I think there are some policies, I think, that we should use a youth lens to run through a set of policies, right? It's almost like a sieve, okay? Take the youth priorities and then check some of the policies. Some of them are obvious. Education, we've talked about. Land, for example. Marriage, reproductive health. Those things, and I've never seen it done. I've never seen a methodology where you say, okay, these are the priorities for youth. Let's look at all your policies. Let's look at your land policies. Let's look at your gender policies. Let's look at your education policies. And then sort of run it through and say, okay, is it negative or is it positive for youth? I would love to be able, as a group of donors, to try it. Pick a country and let's do it. Develop the methodology and try it. See what comes out, right? Because we don't know what's going to come out. And that could perhaps help us to say, okay, we found that there were 2 things that really, really matter in this context, and we should focus our attention on that. Okay. The other thing is, what are we measuring? I think there were interesting questions about the surveys. The way we come at it is usually to do household-type surveys or labor market surveys. To try to understand youth, let me suggest that they're close to useless. The youth gets swallowed into the household, so the young person gets averaged out. The labor market surveys, we talked about labor markets already. I'm always puzzled by how young people survive. We know they're in the street corners, right? I would love to see something like a time use study. What is it that they do throughout the day? You will find very often that they have 3, 4 ways of trying to generate some money, some cash. Mark has a wonderful couple of charts in his book on Uganda, where he shows what youth buy and how many hours of work, of what type of work it takes them to buy that. Right? This is the dynamic of the youth life of a young man or a young woman in the streets. We don't understand it, and our instruments are not helping us. There's anecdotal evidence, right? Everybody goes and you can spend intensive hanging out, as I think one of the panelists said. But we can do better as social scientists to systematize that knowledge and put it in front of the economists that says, look, this is rigorous surveys, okay, that tells you what the daily life of a young man is, right? Maybe we will find out that, yes, they spend a lot of time trying to do work, but it's very unproductive. So it may take them 8 hours to raise $5 with which they will eat and buy cigarettes and a beer, okay? If we come at it that way, maybe we can look at it as a productivity problem. How do you enhance the productivity of that informal activity that the young person is doing anyway? Okay, a couple more, and don't get nervous. The other one is, I think is implicit in Mark's introduction. I think we need to take this conversation away from the economist. I think we need to bring other disciplines into this conversation. I think we will never understand the reality of marginalized youth simply by talking to economists. I would like to see historians, I would like to see anthropologists, sociologists help us understand that reality. Economists tend to understand what they measure. If they can't measure it, they tend not to focus on it, right? So we need to give them another way to measure things, and we need to bring somebody else into this discourse to challenge us, what our preconceived assumptions are. 2 more points, I promise. The other one is a mea culpa and a confession. I don't know how to think about young women. I am part of I think the accepted wisdom that when we talk about youth, we talk about male youth. If somebody has any ideas on how, as a development practitioner, we need to think about it, I'd be most delighted to hear it. And my question is it simply a question of reproducing within the youth cohort the same gender imbalance that prevails in the rest of society? If so, is there a separate dimension to female youth within the youth cohort, or is it the same? Or should we be working within the youth cohort to begin changing the attitudes and the norms of the young people, hoping that then sort of feeds into the rest of society? I simply don't know the answer. The last one is one that it's a little bit difficult to challenge, but I felt for a long time that we should have this conversation. And this is a conversation about universal primary education. I think a lot of the panelists were questioning the investment in primary education. And listen, the reality is that even if you get to 95 or 100% enrollment rates in African primary education, even the kids that complete education often are functionally illiterate. So you've wasted the resources. Question is, if this is coming at the expense of secondary education, is this really smart? Mm-hmm. In institutions such as mine, you cannot challenge that. Primary education is motherhood. Everybody should have access to primary education. But at least I think we should be more honest and have that conversation and question ourselves. Forget about the MDGs. I mean, that's a political kind of it. But really, country by country, we should be having this conversation about secondary versus primary. I probably took tons more than 10 minutes. But
no, that's fine. Okay, so thanks, Ian, for sparking, I'm sure, lots of thinking and probably lots of questions from the audience. We're now going to do a sort of a team presentation with Mark and Nicole, and they're going to put me to work on the PowerPoint. So we have to set that up. Where's Mamkhadi or which one it is? You know which?
So I'm going to kick it off for Mark and I. So thanks to Mark and Steve and everyone for putting this together. And thanks to you all for being here. It's nice to be with colleagues and partners and friends and new faces in this thinking. We entitled our presentation Policy Thinking Around Youth and Conflict in Africa. And I'm going to kick it off with the broadest of those 3 issues, the sort of youth at large, and introduce some of our thinking around youth and conflict policy, and then turn it over to Mark to sort of drive that into our Africa thinking. Some of you may know that we are currently, we USAID are currently drafting and will soon be releasing our agency's first ever policy on youth and development. And Mark and I are privileged to lead the team that's been working very hard for almost a year now to put that together. And so we thought we'd start with just sharing a few thoughts at, I said, the broadest level of youth policy, and talk about why are we doing this youth policy. You said it's the first ever. And the first main point is that really the policy was driven by mission demand, and there's an increasing recognition across our agency that really youth development is central to good overall development, and that having better outcomes for youth is going to bring better outcomes for everyone across our core development areas. As many of you may be familiar with, if not, you should go to our website and check it out. Several months ago, we released the agency's overall policy framework for the next 4 years. It came out at the end of 2011. And so really across those 7 development areas, youth are increasingly seen as central to that work for a number of reasons. We've heard repeatedly from Mark and others about the numbers, so I don't need to dwell on them. But it's enough to say that we all recognize the demographic imperative, if you will. At the same time, we've had a historically strong youth portfolio. To Ian's point, that's often been siloed. We've done some great youth livelihood work or some great youth health work, so on and so forth. But it's been disconnected, and there's an increasing realization that we need to bring those different programs and in some part different sector-based strategies and policies together around a coherent sense of principles, a sense of best practice to really infuse that work and think about moving forward in a more coordinated, holistic, we've heard that word come up today, systemic way to reach that scale and sustainability. And as we go forward, Mark will probably pick up on some of those points as well. At the same time, while there's an increasing recognition within our own agency, as you've heard, there's an increased recognition globally as well, whether it's increased activity in the UN system and UN International Year of the Youth, and in particular among our partners, our implementing partners, our thought partners, that this demographic is central to development, and it really sort of called upon us to take that leadership step and bring the agency forward in this thinking. And as we think about the size of this demographic, and as has been said, the characteristics of the youth transition and increasing recognition that programming sort of for and with youth should be different, should be designed intentionally to sort of accommodate and recognize and consider, if you will, the transitions that youth are going to cognitive, physiologically, cognitively, psychosocially, and that's particularly relevant in the conflict context. And I'm sure again we'll come back to that point, but that's something that is increasingly recognized as well. So that brings us to sort of our broad policy. Oh, look, it's already up. Moving faster than I am. Sorry. Maybe that's a hint. So there's a few ways that we've infused our policy with the conflict sense. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had when really setting off on this, to speak candidly, is this is a policy that speaks for the agency at large. So we need it to speak to our health officers, our ag officers, our democracy and governance officers, our economic officers, so on and so forth, across all of our regions. But we also, so it's global, but there's an explicit awareness that it needs to be contextually applicable and relevant. One of those sort of 7 core development areas is around mitigating conflict and responding to sort of disaster and crisis environments. So how do we make sure that the youth policy speaks to those environments as much as it speaks to other kinds of environments? So it's a challenge, and one of the ways that we're thinking about is that this policy is global and is a first step, and I'm sure Mark will talk a bit more about, but we see it living and breathing as we go through in different sector strategies and policies that the agency is putting out or has put out, whether that be our education strategy, our forthcoming interagency strategy on children and adversity, our policy on countering violent extremism, countering trafficking in persons, the gender policy that's recently come out, gender equality policy. So how does we see those as certainly interlinked, but this policy should speak to those, but also speak again to the specific regions and different situations in which we're working. We also say the policy is knowledge-based, but cognizant of evidence gaps. And we, recognize in our work that there is a lot of best and promising practice from our own work, from those of our partners in the implementing community. But there are evidence gaps. How do we know what works best in certain situations, in conflict situations? How this came up earlier in the earlier panel. How applicable does what worked in an Africa sort of post-conflict situation work in a Latin American gang prevention situation? So there's an increasing recognition that this policy is going to sort of help set that agenda as we move forward and help us sort of move forward in that. So another way that we've sort of infused conflict thinking and a conflict lens into our broad youth policy thinking is around protection. Many of our sort of youth development purist colleagues, if you will, when we think about youth development, are very sort of focused on the support, the preparation, the engagement aspects of youth development. And there's an increasing recognition that our broad policy on youth and development needs to incorporate those protection elements. And in large part, that's due to recognizing that we are working in conflict areas where protection elements are so important. So there's a lot of that thinking infused into our work as well. Excuse me. We've also thought a lot about how sort of conflict and regional contextual realities infuse our understanding of the youth context in particular, as well as some of the core principles that we're putting forth. So in the context, and I'll just try to speak briefly to these, we've heard this come up already today, the idea of the sort of youth bulge versus the demographic dividend. Youth bulge being more of a socioeconomic, often negative connotated term. And what we're really thinking in our policy is how do we move towards a more sort of positive view, a demographic dividend being the more economic-oriented term, but again, that sort of how do we harness that energy and the demographic potential towards more positive ends. And the idea of perpetrators and victims, recognizing that youth are often drawn into conflict situations as perpetrators, but also as victims. And how do we think about policies and programs that address both of those dynamics? Distorted transitions, that's come up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, as we've heard, as we know, youth that are coming through conflict periods, particularly young women, girls, female youth, often have distorted transitions, are pulled out of school, have limited economic opportunities. So how do we think about that in our sort of global policy? And the other point that's come up quite a bit is just the idea of who are youth. And this is a tough one. I mean, Mark's opening slide showed how the differences within the UN system. But actually, it even goes beyond that. I mean, if you look at even within there's not necessarily consensus among the UN technical agencies. UNFPA, for example, goes from 10 to 24, whereas some of the other ones go from 15 to 24. We've talked about the African Union context, and so what does that mean for us? And this was one of the biggest questions that, quite frankly, we had to tackle when we sat down. And where we've landed is. We're viewing youth, if you will, as 10 to 29, and we're saying view as opposed to being very finite because we don't see it, as another point was made this morning, as having a fixed beginning and a fixed end. Youth is a period of transition. And some have asked, why do we need to bracket it all? And this relates back to the earlier point about being evidence-based and learning. In fact, we haven't done a great job of tracking our investments in young people over time. And it's something that we recognize we need to do better to better learn and be more evidence-based going forward. And so that's where that's coming from. And we're sort of working hard to make sure that view is coordinated across our agency, again, with our colleagues that are working on children's issues and so on and so forth, and is respectful of, at the end of the day, what we're saying within that view is that we're being very respectful of the countries where we're working, which have very diverse views in and of themselves, their national policies, their national laws, often conforming to international norms around children or not. So how does that fit in? But it's a challenge, and it's something that we think very critically about. As far as the principles that we're sort of looking at in the policy, and I'm just going to tee up a couple of them. There's sort of 7 main ones. Hopefully you can see them on the slide. I know Mark is going to speak to them a little bit more in some of the specific programming examples. But just a couple of the key ones that we really think are particularly relevant in the conflict and post-conflict environment. And sort of first one I'll speak to is the youth participation is vital. It's a critical element that we've heard come up in the morning panel, and it's actually front and center in the naming of our policy, which is very intentionally called youth in development as opposed to youth and development or even simply youth development. Administrator Shah, some of you may have seen, did an article, an interview for the Financial Times that came out a couple months ago, sort of previewing the policy as it was being developed, and sort of reiterated this point that we increasingly see youth as key actors and leaders in development, not only as young people transitioning through, but as players, leaders in shaping their communities and their countries. And so with that intentionality, we include youth in development, and it's a principle, but it's also just a theme throughout, and quite frankly was very much factored into the process of putting this policy together. We did a number of listening sessions and consultations across the agency with our partners, but importantly with young people in the developing world, in Uganda and in about 15 plus countries. So we wanted to really pull that out as front and center as we think about peace building. And I know it's something Saji will probably speak to as well. That participation piece is vital. Creating second chances, we've talked about that. I'm sure we're going to talk a little more about that. The idea of building assets to create resilience, and making individual resilience as well as sort of an aggregate. I'm going to sort of stop there because I know I'm running on, and I want to make sure my colleague has enough time to talk through. But thanks, and take it away.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and Mark for inviting us here today. It's always problematic, as Ian mentioned, coming after an incredibly distinguished group of panelists, and you want to kind of rearrange all your slides. I'm kind of running. I'm going to go through several of these highlights. Some of these things will come as very obvious to you, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview of some of the donor trends that are going on right now with a nexus between youth and conflict. Both very nascent development interventions and research agendas that we shouldn't forget that really haven't been around in terms of being research and development practitioners really glomming onto them. So there is the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, the post-Busan focus on aid effectiveness and demonstrating results. This has a couple of things that are very important for youth in conflict. One is there is an emphasis on local ownership for programs. This means not only local governments, regional governments, state governments, but also local partners. So the NGOs, the youth groups, the youth-led, the youth-build groups that we want to work more towards building up, sustaining, and scaling. The other issue is also about resilience. Now, in the conflict field, we talk about underlying factors for conflict. We talk about dynamics. We talk about the grievances for conflict. And I think probably over the years we were emphasizing that so much because we were trying to get other policy practitioners and development practitioners to get on board with understanding conflict dynamics, to the detriment, perhaps, of understanding the resiliency side, to understanding what are the mitigating factors, what really are behind the communities, the young people around the world who are actually not engaging in violence, who are not engaging in conflict, widespread, or even in civil conflict or any kind of political instability. What is actually maintaining that? And I think a lot of what has come out of the World Development Report from 2011, as well as that has been imbued then in the USAID policy framework, as Nicole mentioned, with a very specific objective on focusing on crisis-affected countries. There's also, and this might seem very obvious too, there's also greater focus on security issues and increased donor funding for fragile contexts. Today, close to 60% of state and USAID's foreign assistance goes to 50 countries that are in the midst of or trying to prevent conflict or state failure. That might not sound like a lot, but it is an incredible exponential leap from just several years ago of that focus and that realization that these are places that we need to focus our attention. And taking what we're doing with youth and melting it with some of these issues that are coming together with conflict and addressing crisis countries is something that is monumental. There's renewed donor focus on inclusivity and agriculture-driven economic growth. as we've heard a lot about. This inclusivity is not just about the elites versus the non-elites and bringing those non-elites on board, but that is something that we're hoping with the policy that we can try to imbue. But it's also about the new aidscape. It's about who are the partners. It is not just about donors monolithically walking into a country in a post-conflict environment and saying, okay, we're here to help, but ignoring perhaps the local realities of the burgeoning NGO communities or the partners on the street and the local, perhaps informal economy and informal structures that are still there. There are the foundations, there are the faith-based groups, there are the universities. It goes on, and including the private sector. Everybody is actually playing a part in this space now, and youth are a major focus of a lot of those partners. The last point I want to make on this slide is risk-taking and do no harm. As a person who professes a lot about conflict mitigation, do no harm principles are sometimes every other word is about do no harm. Increasingly, donors, and specifically USAID, is really challenging our own people to take on more risk. What does this mean? It means actually working in a lot of the context that we heard before in the previous panel. It means actually taking on those risks, and the fact is, can you do those with actually preventing unintended negative consequences? And it's actually one of those things where there have been debates within USAID about, if I take on further risk, I can't be held accountable for what might happen. Or if I'm held accountable for what might happen, I don't want to take on those risks. But I think somewhere out there, there is a balance between taking on more risk and doing service with do no harm principles. Will we make mistakes? Yes. Do we need more research in what works and what doesn't work? Yes. I don't have a golden ticket for it. However, at the end of the day, we need to be able to admit mistakes and learn from them. I'm doing two things at once. It's like walking chewing gum. That's why I work in the government. Sorry. A couple things specifically in youth and conflict in the Nexus and the awareness more at USAID on the more kind of micro level. With this policy, we're also trying to with a lot of policies that are coming out from USAID right now, we're stressing that analysis is crucial upfront, and in a post-conflict setting, continual analysis to understand exactly what are the different dynamics that are affecting young people in a particular stage of the post-conflict or the crisis awareness, and how that fits into the social construct. We're also trying to bust some myths. Youth bulges do not lead inexorably to conflict, however, create special challenges and opportunities to societies. And trying to understand that those opportunities, as Ian alluded to, are areas that, for economic growth, for international and national security, are areas that we want to focus on. Sustainable impact beyond peace-building activities. Localized youth engagement and training adds value. However, absent structural policy reform, they're not enough to prevent conflict or achieve peace. Really coming out of CDA, the Listening Project, understanding specifically, and this gets to that dicey issue of engaging governments, engaging policymakers in the states in which we're working to make sure that the structural conditions are changing. Otherwise, the post-conflict work that we're doing, a lot of the community-based work that isn't attached to sustainable government interventions, or at least long-term interventions, is not necessarily going to prevent peace. You need to address those grievances, and those grievances with youth actors are going to be key. Formal and informal education for youth, relevant and market-linked vocational and skills training provides greater focus on local economic recovery. Our economic growth colleagues have admitted, as economists, I'm not an economist, but they have admitted, and it was hard for them to say this, that informal markets in a post-conflict area are areas that need to be upheld. That we cannot turn our back on informal economies, black markets, gray economies. These are key to maintaining youth employment, to maintaining a cohesiveness in societies and communities. And then gender recognition, focusing on the specific needs of adolescent girls and ensuring their participation, as we've heard from experts here before, and I won't get into more details about that, because that is imbued also in our gender equality policy. just a couple of examples, and there are myriad of examples, and Kate could speak to this in more depth than we ever could. But in terms of just making sure that there are examples that we want to point to that we're using that are in the field now that really take on some of these principles that we want to have in this policy. Cote d'Ivoire, post a lot of the conflict that occurred in 2010 and 2011 in the contested presidential elections. Our Office of Transition Initiatives typically will go in very quickly and look for ways to work in a blend of political, media, reconciliation, communications. Specifically, they looked for non-elite groups. They wanted to make sure that different ethnic and tribal and religious groups who were at odds with each other were actually being brought together initially, but not going to those elite groups that were headed by certain elite leaders. It seems to have had some good effect. I know Sajia and Search for Common Ground have also worked very closely with them. So it also imbues that participation by youth at the very beginning. In Somalia, we're using a lot of technology and innovation in places where you wouldn't necessarily think that is appropriate. The New York Times several years ago said that the cot trade, cellular technology, as well as remittances were really the most functioning economic areas in Somalia. Taking that to heart, mobile phone technology is used for workforce development, basically transmitting opportunities for trainings, opportunities for workforce development, soft skills, as well as employment opportunities. Although it's a little out of the immediate context of Sub-Saharan Africa, I put Morocco on here for a specific reason in moving some of our conversation also to countering violent extremism. Several years ago, we did a cross-sectoral youth assessment, which basically brought in youth to talk about how to assess, design, implement, and monitor and evaluate their own programs. And one of the areas that was of concern for the international community as well as for the Moroccans was the burgeoning issue of violent extremism. And so an innovative program was designed by which we have engaged youth in prisons in specific areas on soft skills development and mentoring, basically linking them with when they're going to be leaving in a year or in 6 months to an NGO and a local community, which then helps further that mentoring in those soft skills and finds them job placement. And lastly, I'll just mention the Youth Map and Youth Innovation Fund, which is carried out by IYF, which is, again, looking at how important analysis and assessment is in linking analysis to grant opportunities for immediate impact. But this also brings in the fact that youth are involved from every stage, and the analysis and even the research that you're doing are interventions. And that the very beginning, engaging them from the very beginning all the way through that programming cycle is key. And it's something that we hope to instill in this policy.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. And Nicole, I just will state that among bilateral donors in particular, the fact that there is forthcoming youth policy at a major donor institution, bilateral in particular, is really groundbreaking. I mean, this is new. Gender policies we know, but youth policies are still new, and it's quite exciting. I was very glad to have both of you come and present. I was also thrilled to have Kate make time to join us today, because when we think of African youth in terms of what should we do, normally the first thing we think of is security. And so I wanted to have a security perspective on this panel. And Kate is a part of and was organizing an extremely interesting youth and security, African youth and security activity that she's now going to talk about. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark and Steve, for having me here. Contrary to my bio, I'm not here to give the development practitioner's perspective, but to speak from more of a security perspective of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and hopefully give an example, tell you a little story about a series of programs that we've been running, coming at the youth are dangerous sort of myth and stereotype, and particularly when we think about the youth bulge in Africa, and how we can inform ourselves both as U.S. policymakers and African policymakers to engage more productively and creatively around the challenge of youth bulge and youth exclusion. So the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, one or two words of background for those who aren't familiar with it. It is a regional center under the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So it is a DoD institution based at the National Defense University. It supports Africa policy work for OSD as well as for Africa Command. It was formed in 1999, so it's pre-existed or predated AFRICOM by a few years. Basically what it does is it engages senior level African security sector, both military, police, customs, intelligence, general national security categories, officials in senior level seminar type courses and programs, typically 1 to 2 weeks long. There is one longer program, 4 weeks, for the rising generation of African security sector leaders, and covering a number of core themes on civil-military relations in Africa, as well as more topical, of-the-moment topics, maritime security. This particular set of programs we've been doing on countering violent extremism. What we've been doing there in my role is a senior fellow bridging security and development, and so this very much falls into what we see as the nexus in Africa of some of our security and development challenges, and how security sector can understand the development perspective better, and how the development perspective can understand the security perspective better, which is an ongoing thing. So I want to very quickly just give you some background, goals and objectives, findings and policy implications from 2 programs now that the Africa Center has run on preventing terrorism or countering violent extremism. And I'll start by saying that they were asked to do this by the State Department's Coordinator for Counterterrorism, which has now subsequently become its own bureau at State, and in the context of an overall administration effort to focus more on countering violent extremism and the preventive side of countering terrorism. So there's, I think, several years of lead up into these programs that are Africa specific in this case. Specifically, how to engage the security sector in upstream factors leading to insecurity from violent extremist organizations. What does that mean, and how can we approach that and change the discussion from purely countering terrorism in the Africa context to looking at factors that maybe we can do something about or better understand before we get to the point of a terrorist incident happening or being about to happen. To do this, the Africa Center decided to take, an empirical approach, looking at what do we know already about drivers of radicalization and violent extremism. And then secondly, use their vantage point of being able to mobilize African leaders, policymakers, officials, as well as through partnership with USAID and the State Department, bringing in civil society and other voices to the discussion. So one, to inform U.S. policymakers what was the priority from African policy perspective and how do they view these challenges. And secondly, to bring some of the empirical evidence that parts of the U.S. government were already grappling with, some of it specific to Africa, some of it more broadly with respect to that. And I would just commend a study that USAID commissioned on drivers of violent extremism, which you can find on their website if anyone is interested in that more specifically. And then finally, we took the starting question of why isn't there more violent extremism or terrorism emanating from Africa, trying to flip the question around a bit. There's endemic poverty, youth bulge, you name it, all the risk factors are there, and yet, in fact, the amount of problem coming out of that is relatively little compared to other parts of the world. And so why is that? Maybe we should, both of us, try and understand that, American policymakers and African policymakers, so that we can make sure that we're not doing things to negate those resiliencies and strengths that do exist on the continent in the course of trying to address a challenge. This led to a program in April of last year, 2011, in Dakar that was Pan-Africa. We looked at North, East, and West Africa more specifically. We had participants from 14 countries across those regions, and some 63 African participants, as well as U.S. government, European, and a few international donor participants as well. We tried to innovate upon the model of the Africa Center in terms of bringing senior security sector officials together to include development ministries, finance, education, housing, employment, basically whatever the sending country wanted to select from within that basket, as well as culture and communications. So we set the program up to have a cross-section of participants from African governments, dealing from the security lens, from a development lens, from a culture or communications lens. And then we also brought civil society representatives, which is not typical for an Africa Center program. And that was courtesy of the USAID Africa Bureau funding those participants. So interagency collaboration and cooperation. It was very interesting to have that mix of perspectives within the room, talking about and considering what are drivers of violent extremism in Africa, specifically, not just generally in the world. What are the likely vulnerable populations or groups or individuals for those drivers? What are the resiliencies already found within African societies and states, and that should be recognized? And then what are some responses that African policymakers, together with American government partners and other donor partners, could look at? We came out of that program with a very strong emphasis on youth, and that leads to the program that Mark is particularly, I think, focused on, and that we sought his counsel before we proceeded to our next session. And basically we recognized, and primarily coming from our African participants, that governments ignore youth to their peril. Youth are the majority of these societies, and as we've heard a number of panelists already mention, that needs to be more and more integrated into all policymakers' understanding and approach to their particular responsibilities. Context matters, and cross-sectoral approaches, we came away with a very strong affirmation for not everybody doing everything, but recognizing when different sectors, either of government or society, needed to engage with each other in order to find the best possible solution or support. That led us to a follow-on program in Kigali in January of this year, focused on East Africa as a sub-region. And this program, we focused on preventing youth radicalization in East Africa. So building from the findings of our Pan-Africa, mostly Pan-Africa discussion in Dakar, we then focused in on East Africa, where we had 11 countries and some 45 African participants, again across security, development, culture, communications, civil society. And then our further innovation for this program was to actually try and bring youth voices directly to the table. So not just to have a bunch of people talking about youth and what do they care about in Africa and what does life look like for them in East Africa, but to actually have some voices there to directly share their experiences, both as plenary speakers and then in the discussion groups that take place throughout the course of this week-long program after every plenary. And we had a fascinating discussion come out of that, looking again at the dynamics and the responses of youth radicalization in East Africa. Why isn't there more than there is? Why do the efforts that are there sometimes compel and sometimes don't? Are youth a threat or an opportunity, as we keep hearing over and over again? So our premise was that radical organizations understand, prey upon the combination of political realities, socioeconomic factors, individual characteristics in their efforts to recruit youth, recognizing that there are many different kinds of radical organizations. And so how can we then understand those drivers, understand what East African youth's resiliencies and coping mechanisms are, generate policy options to mitigate drivers and support coping mechanisms. The findings are very consistent, I think, with what we heard from the first panel, so I'm going to try and breeze through those real quickly and get to the policy implications. But participants recognize that understanding youth on the edges of society, economy, politics, and government requires disaggregating youth populations. We have to get beyond generalities, and in fact, context does matter very specifically here. Radicalization is an individual process. Sense of identity, purpose, community are often far more compelling than the macro level indicators or drivers or risk factors that we tend to focus on as policymakers. And that then challenges us to think about how do you best get in the middle of that radicalization process or get ahead of it and stop it. And maybe it's not the state. Maybe it's not the public actor that does that. Socioeconomic challenges of education, employment, housing, leading to this crisis of delayed adulthood that we've heard a lot about already. Youth frustration stemming from injustice, impunity, corruption among political leaders and security forces. We had our youth participants really speak very strongly about how manipulated they were prior to elections and then ignored as soon as elections are over by leaders in their region. And how to get non-elite youth voices into these discussions, not just the elite youth. And then the most significant finding was that youth largely do cope through the informal sector, and they have their own safety nets and their own businesses and entrepreneurial ways of surviving, essentially. And security forces in particular are often the biggest enemy of youth in those realities. And so for our security sector participants, how they could understand that and sort of overcome some of those challenges was a key it was a key process that went on during the week that was very interesting to watch. So the policy implications or takeaways that we came from the discussion in Kigali. Upstream drivers require multi-sectoral responses. So we have to work within governments across security, development, culture, communications, tourism, sports. All these ministries may be relevant in certain situations. And it's important not to just pigeonhole youth as one ministry's responsibility. And usually it's the ministry our youth participants noticed with the longest title name in their government, meaning it's the lowest priority of whatever the government ministry was about. We also we recognized, coming from the participant discussions, that civil society and faith groups are far more compelling to youth than state actors are, even non-security state actors. And so how can the state enable civil society and faith-based groups rather than impede them was an important discussion for policymakers. How to empower, in that regard, the most credible voices to countering radical ideologies. And sometimes that takes us out of our comfort zone in terms of working with faith-based leaders and, again, for many of our African governments, working with civil society even directly. For state policymakers, what are the sources of structural marginalization and discrimination that state policies actively contribute to, wittingly or unwittingly? Regional discrimination in terms of economic distribution of benefits from state services, ethnic issues, et cetera. For our security services, very much they were compelled by their role as the enemy of youth, or this perception coming from youth participants, and especially in breaking up informal markets and economies and sort of creating this aversion to authority and this resentment from some youth populations in the region. So how can they have outreach programs? And we had many discussions of examples of that. In terms of education, economy, relevant job skills, our colleague mentioned this already this morning, but what is the market looking for? Not what do education providers or the state want to provide, but what is the market seeking in terms of job skills? That's most important. Business skills. Most youth on the margins do survive on their own entrepreneurial activities, so how can we help them in that regard? What about industries that youth are most interested in? Digital video recording and sound recording. What can governments be doing to help the distribution and marketing and production networks for those industries that do pertain to where youth activities are? We had a lot of discussion about youth culture over the course of our week, and why it was important, even as non-youth, to understand and relate to youth culture. And this is nothing new for the world. But we took a chance in our program, and we invited a Somali rapper who lives in Eastleigh in Nairobi, Shine, who is, he's a hero among Somali and Kenyan youth, and known throughout the region in terms of a very popular singer. He'd never been to a conference like this before, and we asked him to come and tell his story and make a presentation. And that was already taking some risks, both for how our participants were going to receive that, and also for him, and then what he would go back and tell his peers and friends and colleagues and those that he influences and touches about these efforts. I think it came off very well. We can talk about that more later if people are interested. We also had a lot of discussion about social media and sort of our obsession maybe on the West that social media is, the way to communicate with the youth. And our youth participants really saying, no, it's our mobile phones and texting as well as listening to FM radio that was more compelling for them, and that was important reality. So policymakers across the board, how do we think outside the box? How do we work with non-traditional actors who aren't most comfortable for us and take some risk? And lastly, I'll just say that I was very encouraged and found great hope coming out of this discussion, watching barriers being broken down between security officials and youth participants, within the region, between the delegation from the Seychelles and Somalia. That was a very interesting dynamic. South Sudan and Seychelles had never sat together before in the same room. So even just having the conversations and bringing what we've all decided is, common sense and well known in terms of the empirical realities thus far, but bringing that to ever wider audiences of policymakers and offering the opportunity for that discussion to happen is, in fact, one way we can try and take this challenge further. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, so Saji, you're next. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, Steve, the Africa program for inviting me here. It's a tremendous honor to be sharing the podium with some amazing leaders and heroes and sheroes that I've followed for many, many years now in the youth field. So thank you for that opportunity. I reflect back a little bit because in the early 2000s, I sat in actually the room across the hallway with the Howard Volpe talking about youth and conflict. And it's startling, even though we've made tremendous progress in this field, we kind of haven't, and it's kind of sad. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey and challenge you a little. To imagine yourself, go in the future as a young person. This is easy for you. In the future, you're a young person. Now here comes the challenge. Now think of yourself as someone in the fringes that we've been describing. Someone who is selling water in a plastic bag on the street corner, or bubble gum, or being a prostitute, or a political agitator. That's who you are in the future. And hold that thought for a little. When we look at this conversation we've had over the last couple of hours, several things have come out. One is this, Ian mentioned this also, for state and civil society partnerships to happen. I think that's a growing need. I'm going to make some very quick points because I'm running short on time. Also, this growing need that it's not enough for civil society actors to be accountable to our donors, but it's more important to be accountable to our partners on the ground, to our, some people say beneficiaries, some people, we would like to say partners, who are young people. How can we be more accountable? And this post-Busan, Mark, you mentioned this as well. With this conversation, we've started an exercise looking at what has been the cumulative impact of assistance for youth programs in conflict transition environments. Lots of money gets thrown in. We know that money doesn't solve the problems. We know that the issues are much more complex than just throwing money at the problem. So what we are trying to do is take a step back and ask ourselves, what has been the cumulative impact? And this process has been interestingly led in partnership with lots of different stakeholders. One, several students are here from American University who just got back from Liberia. And I'll mention this a little more. But they have a partnership with American University students working in partnership with a whole cross-sector of young people in Liberia, including FLY, but other young organizations who have not been in the mainstream of programming, to understand this impact. And what they're doing is not necessarily a focus group, not necessarily a survey, but it's much more scientific, much more rigorous than that. What they're doing, though, is really what their parents and generations have been doing for many, many, many years, is having conversations. It's not a fancy term. It's called listening and learning. And that's what they've been doing for the last month in Liberia, trying to understand this and getting amazingly different perspectives. And that's, I don't want to speak for the group because the group will be speaking about the results in the next few weeks. Those will be coming out. What's fascinating, though, is that this model is youth-led, but the partnership is working with the Ministry of Youth and also the Ministry of Statistics to make sure that they are collecting data that is within this youth section that they're looking at within Liberia 15 to 35 that is not collected. So evidence-based that you are talking about is what they're trying to get. But it's also interesting that it's bubbling up, that they're looking at creating a youth engagement matrix. How can young people hold the government and international actors accountable when they're spending money in our country? And they're trying to create this accountability structure that is very different. And it's interesting that this is coming out from young people itself in all 15 counties that we are engaging in. And so that's something I wanted to highlight as something that is very out there. Margaret or some other lady who talked about positive example. Here's an example where young people are really taking ownership of a process. They also, few more minutes left. So one other thing I wanted to mention is this whole notion of us focusing. We've talked about this even at last night's dinner. If we, as donors, policymakers, implementers, we focus at a country level. But young people are not looking at a nation-state, country-level concept. They're looking beyond borders, and they're moving across borders. But our focus is on a country level. So how do we challenge ourselves to look across the divides, to look beyond just our countries to see how we can position ourselves from a conflict prevention perspective, but also conflict mitigation perspective? I take a step back and look, back in 2000, in 1990s, late 1990s, look at the women's movement. The women's movement is just like the youth movement today. It's organized, but it is budding. What if the youth movement can learn a significant amount from the women's movement? And there's a lot of folks talking about what's the potential for a Security Council resolution on youth. What can we learn from UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and 1889, for example? And how can that inform young people's participation in peace building? And how can young people be part of that process? So that's another important element from a policy perspective that is coming out there. There's also conversations at the UN level about a life cycle approach to engaging with young people, children, adolescents, and youth. At the same time, there's others having a conversation about having an ecologically more systems approach in a context-specific process. How can we combine them as peace practitioners to make sure that it's not one without the other? That's something we learned from the morning conversation too. How do we look at the intersection of those? And how do we invest in that? So going back to that question about, as you're looking in the future now, you're thinking of young people as marginalized in your image on the street corners. What is it that you wish you knew now that you can inform your future generations? How do you take the knowledge you have today to make sure you can have a better impact today? Because I hope 3 years from now when we have these conversations that we probably have evolved in our practice and our knowledge. And I think that's a great challenge we have, and I really hope we hold ourselves accountable to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Saji. How much time, Steve? How much time? So how much time for discussion?
3 minutes.
Okay. All right, so we have almost 20 minutes for discussion. Let's take a handful of questions at once and then ask our panelists. So just raise your hand and then I think there's the man in the back there. Yes.
Hello. My name is Thomas Spoon, and I'm an intern for Trans-African. I'm originally from Sierra Leone, came here 8 years ago. And my question is, I know most of the time when people from Africa come over and study in the universities and trying to go back home and do changes, the people in place, government in place, does not really have room to bring them in, to allow them in, because they see them as a foreigner, as a threat. But on the other hand, they let NGOs like De Beers and Shell come in and take all the money, the resources, and leave the people for nothing. So my question is, for somebody like me who want to go back home and trying to do something politics, run for president, what can we do when we go back home? Because there's going to be so many difficulties, and see, we have more of a challenge. We're trying to help the country than the other people that come in just to rip it up. So what can we do as a young people that have experience to civil war firsthand? What can we do when we go back home to be trying to help out?
Okay, thank you for that. Someone else? I guess right in front of you. Yeah, sure. Right there. Anne?
Hi, I'm Amy West from AIR. I just had a practical question for USAID. We've all been waiting with great expectation for the youth strategy to come out. And we also believe there will be several IQCs following that. So we're wondering if there's any sort of a time frame, even though specificity may be difficult, but we've been looking for this since last year, and really with great expectation. That's not a negative.
Okay. Yes, Susan?
Susan Jepler from American University. I was interested earlier when you talked about how youth and gender are sometimes seen as mutually exclusive categories. And I'm wondering if, what is the relationship between youth and childhood? Are those moving towards becoming mutually exclusive categories, or, yeah?
Okay, well, we have three. Let's see. On the Sierra Leone question, Sajid, do you want to maybe take that one?
I'm happy to. Coming from Sri Lanka, leaving the war in Sri Lanka and coming here and trying to taking about 13 years to realize that I have an obligation and a responsibility to go back. So I can hear what you're saying, brother. And I'd love to have a more deeper conversation with you about this, because I struggle with this for many, many years, and as a responsibility I have. But since we're already here, I think we have a lot we can do here itself. Just as much as we can help in our own countries, keeping in mind that we are now outsiders in our own homeland. And that's going to come out in so many ways. Being aware of that, I think, is important, but being thoughtful and humble about how you then go back and follow in the footsteps of others has to be really thought through. So just a quick answer.
Okay, and Amy had a question about the time frame for USAID. Mark, Nicole?
Thanks, Amy. I suppose we half knew that would come out. I mean, the honest short answer is I don't have an actual release date for you yet. The policy is sort of, well on its way. As we've said, we've done significant vetting externally and internally, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to release it in the near future. As for any, following sort of new IQCs, contracting mechanisms, I mean, I think those are, still continue to be under development, both at the central level. And I think one of the other things that we're expecting to see, or, maybe hoping to see coming out of with the policy and just in and of themselves, are an increasing use of other mechanisms. And this is something I've often said before, whether it's our Development Credit Authority. I'm, hearing about newer uses of the Development Credit Authority. For example, there's a new program speaking on the entrepreneurship side in Kosovo, where there's working through local banks to provide low-rate credit to specifically young entrepreneurs. So I just bring that up as one example. So I think, you you are possibly going to see new central mechanisms coming out, as well as country specific, but also all other increasing use of other kinds of mechanisms, whether it be DCA or the Development Innovation Ventures is another example. So thanks.
Okay. And for this question from Susan about the relationship between youth and childhood, I was thinking maybe if anybody wants to jump in on that one. Ian?
I would say it depends. I wouldn't get caught up with labels. It depends. What is your concern? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? If you're trying to solve child labor, for example, there may be instruments and ways of thinking about youth that may be applicable. Or if it's child prostitution or things of that nature. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the labels. Just to give you an anecdote, and this to me it's a question of transitions. You transition from one stage to the other. When that transition exactly happens, in a way, doesn't really matter. When we did the research, and I think we got Gary to do some research in Nigeria, he found the case of one Nigerian man who was 45, and he was still considered youth in Nigeria. Why? Because he hadn't been able to marry and he didn't have a job. So if you take it that way, I think about not the label, but what is the problem that you're trying to analyze, and very often just throw the label away. I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but it's the best I can do.
Nicole?
Just one point I'd add onto that is, and I agree with Ian's points, is also I think we need to think about how young people identify themselves. I think that's something that we heard when we were doing a lot of our listening and consultations with youth. When we asked them that question, who are youth in your country? And on the younger side, I mean, we're seeing often, adolescents ascribing themselves as youth versus children, and whether that's a projection of them wanting to be seen as more independent than children. We'll have to ask them, but I would also just add that point is I think it's also about how young people of different ages within this broad range see themselves and what that means for the programming that's being done, so to speak, for them.
Just a different perspective as well, because I see a lot of other movement, especially at the UN level and globally. There is a lot more now on focus on youth, and the moving a special representative on youth is now appointed, and there's a lot more money now coming towards youth. Then what happens to the children's movement when they are children today, but they are going to be entering into the youth movement tomorrow? How do we make sure that transition happens in a way where we have role models at both three levels, children level, youth level, and also adult level, and making sure that adults understand how to engage at these very different levels. So slightly different perspective I want to throw out.
Okay, let's get some more questions. Okay, right here. She had it right. Okay.
Want to take more? Or?
Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Sarah Sladen. I'm from the Alliance for International Youth Development. My question relates to making the link between the pieces that we've discussed in this room to a kind of broader education agenda around youth development. I was looking at Rajiv Shah's annual letter, and there was talk of the demographic dividend. There was talk of increased interventions in conflict-affected areas. There was almost no mention of youth, half the world's population. And it seemed a sort of strange disconnect, knowing the tremendous effort, which I applaud, that's been put in by Mark and Nicole and others at USAID and Champions of Youth within USAID to push this policy forward. We applaud your efforts and we look forward to seeing the policy, but it seems to me that the next question is translating the efforts and taking these wonderful efforts to develop this policy into strategy and into action. And so my specific question relates to what the role is of civil society organizations, local as well as US-based, to raise awareness around youth development, to highlight this policy, and to try and address the difficult challenge of balancing the complexity and the nuance and the contextual relevance that's necessary with, I think, what Ian Bannon was talking about, which is targeted approaches that are realistic and achievable.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, Diane.
Diane Mazarana from the Fletcher School and Feinstein Center at Tufts University. I had a question for Kate. When you look at kind of drivers of radicalization, what differences did you say between how females were radicalized and how males were radicalized, and how those drivers paid attention to gender in terms of recruitment strategies or what was pushing people in or keeping them out?
Okay, I see. So there was two more. Julius, and then
Thanks. My name is Julius Wani. And the first segment of the question goes to Ian. You mentioned earlier that definitely they're competing. There are too many priorities, yet competing at the same time. And I tend to think that youth activism still play a very critical role, not only in enhancing civic education, but also in correcting government, like corrupt system in Africa. And so it should be one of the competing priorities that should not be neglected. Now, I was just wondering, in the scope of your operation and funding, whether there is some support, there is something that you're doing to support youth activism, not violent activism, but peaceful activism. And the second segment of the question goes to both Mark and Nicole, and it's regarding support and ownership of the process. Like, how's the USAID supporting program? Is there like it allow local ownership of the process if it is youth program, or it's only recruit people from diaspora or from outside, people who are expert in those fields, and send them to the ground, telling them to bring about the changes instead of maybe sending a few or mixing them, both people from the ground or folks from those countries who had the opportunity to be educated in diaspora, and mix them with, let me say, American, and then they go down there, because these folks, to me, they understand the issues not only from the context of their educational level, but from experience. And so when they speak from both experience and professional level. And there's a situation with the World Bank where they're recruiting just college students here and send them to the ground, and they're calling them consultant instead of using folks from those countries who goes to American universities and mix them together as consultant. And of course, this work will help, But it's a situation where a student go out there, like, all right, we are consulted with the World Bank, and these are the issues that we are trying to collect. And they collect the ideas from you and go and represent them as consultant. And instead of World Bank relying on folks who know these issues in and out and make them with this student. Thanks.
Okay. The final question is right here. Yes.
I know that USAID puts so much emphasis and so many funds into health and HIV, and I'm wondering whether the panelists, I wanted to ask this of the last panel as well, of what has been the role of HIV in the studies and the work in the room, or the links to health for education and conflict work.
Okay,
Mary
great.
Lynn Fielden-Gair, consultant at Creative Associates. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Why don't we, there were certain ones that were mentioned. Why don't we just go down the line for final comments? And, Julius had specific questions for Ian and for Mark and Nicole. Diane had a question for Kate. And I think the other two, Sarah's and this last one, I think you're all invited to respond to. So why don't we just start with Ian and then go down from there.
Yeah, on youth activism, I think you have to be a little bit careful, though. It depends what the youth is being active for. Youth activism can quickly turn dangerous for youth. Some of our governments don't welcome youth activism, or at least not in the political arena. And remember, in the societies we're talking about, youth are feared. Precisely because of this sort of security nexus that, they will rise up like they did in the Arab Spring. So understandably, these governments are very nervous. When you say something like, if I go to a ministry and say, the World Bank is going to support youth activism, what do you think the minister is going to tell me? Are you nuts? And so you have to be very careful, and you have to be very careful how you use this term, these terms. I would much rather engage with groups or civil society organizations that have a large membership of young people, working on holding governments accountable for what governments are supposed to do, which is to provide services and public goods. If you construct the discourse around that, if the government is supposed to pick up the garbage and your garbage is not picked up, That's much easier for a government to understand why we development practitioners are concerned about that, and we're using civil society, and we want to strengthen civil society to help the government deliver better services. If you walk into a ministry and say, the youth groups, they're activists, and they're going to monitor your elections, whoops, already you've established a confrontation. And these are sometimes very ruthless governments. And so I would be very careful that you don't put some of these organizations at risk. So I'm a little bit, something in my gut tells me to be a little bit wary of youth organizations. I much prefer these organizations that may have a large proportion of youth in it, but that are much more mixed, because it's a little bit harder for governments to suppress and come down on them. And I think that's something that we haven't quite explored, those sort of social dynamics. What's the social capital? Why do these groups come together? What's the motivation? We tend to say youth, one youth organization. Well, youth is very diverse. Just like the rest of society, they have different interests, they have different biases, they're good and they're bad at the same time. Okay, so we tend to sometimes, and this is not criticism of my colleagues or the panel, but sometimes we use the very easy caricatures. And so that we have this romantic idea of a youth movement led by some young people that are going to overthrow injustice. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Youth are just as complicated and just as messed up as the rest of society. Right? So we need to be much more sophisticated ourselves in how we engage with youth. So I would say be careful. By all means activism, but be careful what you ask youth to be active about, because you may be really endangering their lives. Second, on the consultants, look, we all work in this business. It's the bane of the business. We sort of love and hate them. We love consultants because we need them, and we hate them because sometimes they do what you say. We do, and I think AID probably does the same every development. We try to use as many local consultants as possible. We're pretty smart. We know that they will know the local context better than we do. So it's a complicated thing. But trust me, at least I can speak with all my colleagues at the World Bank. If there is somebody who understands the concept and we can rely on a local consultant, we'll choose that any time over somebody we have to fly in from Finland or from Washington. So.
Okay, so briefly, Mark?
Briefly. Sarah, thanks for your question. I think it stems from a lot of the fact that youth are invisible to development workers because they're everywhere. They're everywhere and therefore perhaps nowhere. I think what happens is, and we did this at the beginning of the policy process, we said, okay, this policy, we're going to finish this really quickly because youth are engaged in almost every activity at one way or another. They're the means by which we then end a particular objective in development, or they're the ends themselves. So they're the youth in development and they're youth development. So this won't be a problem. But what's happened is that they become somewhat secondary. And this is part of the problem in formulating this policy. For example, we have not been, as a government, or as USAID, we have not been collecting age disaggregated data. Our partners do, usually on an ongoing basis, but we have not been. We're correcting that with this policy so that we can have much more of a trend analysis to see how our interventions are actually achieving results or not achieving results. But I think also with the NGO involvement, we talked about this a lot with the policy, which is it stems from a lot of domestic experience. We are backward integrating a lot of our work overseas as part of USAID and the USG to experience that we've had in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in other cities, in working with civil society just in the United States. We take for granted that we have all of these civil society partners here that basically take the place of what we look overseas as the government needs to do this. We're still perplexed when we walk into a country and they say, by all means, work with our Ministry of Youth. We don't have a Department of Youth. We don't necessarily know what that means. Are we the appropriate people to consult with a Ministry of Youth as to how they should strategically plan and resource accordingly with the youth in their country?
Okay. Nicole?
Sure. It's a question about going back home and using local ownership. I think a couple points on that for us. I mean, participation is front and center, and that's been a part of our process, as well as how we will hopefully see our programming with youth going forward. We talked about our listening sessions, but as Mark mentioned, for example, our Youth Map program, which is doing assessments. They've done 2 so far in Uganda and Senegal. There'll be a total of 8 over the next few years in sub-Saharan Africa. And those are youth participating from the very start to end in the design, in the actual investigation and analysis, in the evaluation and the report. And then, as Mark mentioned, in the actual small grants funds that's associated with those projects going forward. But there's a larger also connection that we're hoping to see going forward to sort of local ownership and local organizations. And that's by connecting this policy with our broader agency reform agenda, USAID Forward. Many of you might be familiar with it, but one of the particular aspects of that is about implementation and procurement reform. Not very sexy or jazzy to bring up or talk about, but it's important because one aspect of that is how are we able to work and strengthen host government financial management and accountability systems, as well as audits of local organizations, such that we can put more money directly through government systems, but also into the hands of local organizations. And for where we see that hopefully coming together is in seeing more homegrown youth-led organizations getting money directly. So is it going to happen tomorrow? Probably not, but it just speaks to this sort of higher level, broader way that we're thinking about this in a very real way, and thinking about very meaningful participation, not just token participation. And the other piece I'll mention on that is in terms of the diaspora, because you mentioned that, is something that we're working closely with our diaspora colleagues on. And also really that's where a lot of interagency coordination with our colleagues at the State Department, who are doing a lot of real great work on exchange and in particular bringing in diaspora. And that's an area that we're also trying to coordinate to better make those connections and make sure that where there are possible opportunities for sort of youth to youth synergies and network building, that we're able to help foster those connections as well. So the other point in closing on the health piece, I'll speak a bit to that. And it's absolutely a front and center piece. I mean, HIV/AIDS in particular, but just the broader health space. As a process measure, we actually had one of our team members was from the global health team. Some of you may know Kate Lane. She's a real expert in sort of youth and particularly the population and reproductive health, but really the sort of youth health field at large. And so we've been able to really take advantage of her being on our team. But it goes beyond that into how it's represented in the policy. And as I said in the beginning, it's been, one of the challenges we had was that this policy speak to all of our different kinds of officers and all of our different countries and regions where we work in a way that's real and practical, but also, again, has that diversity. So I didn't necessarily bring it up, but when we think about the context and one of the reasons why, and this childhood to youth transition, one of the other big pieces in the sort of rationales for this policy is the idea of sort of breaking harmful cycles and sustaining our investment gains. In particular in the health space, as many of you know, we make significant investments in 0 to 5, children, children's health, early grade reading. So we want to see those investments sustained into the later years and through adolescence. And that's really often where a lot of the health piece comes in. And it's really also one of the reasons that we are taking this broader view and recognizing that youth transitions often start in earlier adolescence with the onset of puberty and often sexual activity. So there's that. And then as we think about one of our principles of sort of accounting for differences, to your HIV point in particular, and the idea of distorted transitions, it can happen from conflict, but HIV-affected youth are often also stigmatized and fall out of education systems. And so we see second chances as a way to make sure that we're also meeting the needs of HIV-affected youth who often fall out of the system. So I'll sort of end there and say thanks again.
Thanks, Nicole. Kate, Diane had a specific question for you.
Right, very quickly. I wish I were more expert on the differences in recruitment and radicalization trends for females versus males, whether youth or not. I will say that it's on our own research or future policy agenda for the series of programs that we're doing. We have come across several African researchers who have looked at this question of the role of women and the fact that women are also radicalized and they are also recruited. They're not just the front line of defense against radicalization and recruitment, which is the presumption that we hear coming out of our discussions with African colleagues and in our own discussions here in Washington around the issue. And so very important to recognize what are those factors that do appeal and attract female, whether youth or otherwise, in radical ideologies, et cetera, and how to counteract that. Anecdotally, we know from the coast in Kenya that al-Shabaab recruitment has been partly successful because mothers encourage, mostly their sons in this case, but they do encourage them to go and fight with al-Shabaab, whether that's for financial reasons or ideological reasons or otherwise. There are several, but that is one area that we've come across anecdotally. There's some great work done by an Algerian young African female scholar on this question as well. So I'd be happy to talk to you after about that.
Okay, thanks. Saji, any last words?
Few quick points I can make.
Okay.
Few points actually. We always think of youth as this. They fall through the cracks, and they often they send messages out, and we see them as violent. But the reason they are saying we see this as violent is because they act, in a sense, if you take a step back and look at it, they're crying to be heard. And we look at it as a threat and not an opportunity. And how can we shift our thinking to engage them in a different way? And we see this across the board, where and taking it to scale, media is a great way to do it, especially radio in a lot of places in Africa, where they get to hear their own compatriots, comrades, actually doing something different. A positive message is being shared. It actually embeds in their minds, oh, there is a different option for me. I think we need to start thinking in those terms and not always thinking as them as a security threat. I cannot emphasize that more. We look at national elections in Africa. We've had this conversation. Why not invest in local elections where young people have much more of an opportunity to play a role in decision making there? I think that's another opportunity area that we can think of. That's it.
Thanks, Saji, Kate, Nicole, Mark, and Ian for your contributions. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions. And thanks very much. I think we've had a wonderful panel.